All right, everyone, welcome back. Okay, so I want to start from the beginning here. You know, developing our conversation for today. One of my real thoughts, being a newbie to this process, was to kind of try and give everyone a little bit of a let's peel back the curtain and let people understand what involvement, what work goes into these committees developing these standards. So let's start from the beginning. Just to set the stage there with the process of the standard as a whole. Scott, you're the boss, right? You're the chair of the committee. Can you take those initial steps and walk us through those initial, SEI, GI, discussions as how this committee came to be?
Yeah, I mean, it was really a process in organizing and figuring out objectives and what groups were going to attack this. It was about 2015 that the SEI CSAD group, the Codes and Standards Activities Division, which is a subcommittee in the SEI group, identified this need, which many recognized for a while, but they put legs underneath it. Don Scott, Greg Sewells, and Ron Hamburger, one of my colleagues at SGH, who's been very active in codes and standards, offered up my name to try to push this through. I worked with Don and with Greg and with Ron and with the ASCE to develop a proposal for it based on other templates that they had, and set that up and tried to understand, okay, what's the time frame, what's the objective, what are we trying to do? And that got approved through SEI and ASCE sometime in 2017. And then there was a period where ASCE and SEI were working together and also engaging GI, and all of us came together to agree we all wanted to work on this collaboratively. We all start to set that up, get the right pieces in place to mobilize this effort. And really, we became ready to mobilize it right at the beginning of COVID. So maybe beginning of 2020, end of 2019. And then we really started the kickoff production level meetings, March, April 2020, and that's where we started from there.
So if I'm hearing that right, I mean, doing the math, I mean, there's a couple year process just to kind of formulate this idea, to write a proposal before you even get to like the existence of a committee. I mean, it takes a while to develop these things.
Yeah, this proposal took 2 years to bake and get input from folks, and then there was internal collaboration to figure out the right organizations that were going to work on this together. That took another couple of years. In this case, it was 4 years. I would imagine in some cases it could be within 4 to 6 months, but because of this effort, I think this was an entirely different animal.
Yeah, a little ambitious for sure. All right, so Billy, you've been involved in code development, standard development throughout your career. So thinking about this specific effort, right? So Scott just kind of walked us through that initial, like, all right, here's the idea, here's the proposal. Okay, good, you guys can form a committee. What are some of those, like, once that initial steering committee is pulled together, and maybe even speak to that a little bit, like what are those first kind of steps like that you guys went through in early 2020 there at the steering level?
So one somewhat surprising hurdle, I think, that nobody really expected was, and Scott didn't mention this, it was kind of part of his 2 to 4 year plan there, or period there. This committee came out of SEI initially, and when the GI folks first heard about it, there was this impression that this was something that the structural engineers were trying to do without getting the GI involvement. And that was never the intent. So it took a little while for the GI membership, and in particular the Board of Governors, to get on board with this idea that this wasn't some structural engineering power move. And that was not the case at all. And that's why I'm they created this position as the GI liaison to the group. And and that was the role that I was asked to fill. So that was some phone calls and some coordination with some of the louder critics in the membership that were afraid of what was happening. But Chris, as you know, as you're a member of this committee, we have many, many GI members serving on the committee, right? And those structural engineers are actually a minority,
right?
An important minority, but a minority of members. So once that was done, Scott started assembling his steering committee, which was just a small number of key names that he knew were going to be good contributors, and then I'll let Scott address the balance requirements and that sort of thing. I will point out that Scott is very well qualified and to serve in this role. He mentioned Ron Hamburger at SGH. He's very active in ASCE 7. Another SGH colleague of his, Gail Johnson, is also the chair of one of these standards committee. Gail was the originator of the committee that created ASCE 61, the seismic design of piers and wharfs. So kudos to SGH for all their service activities related to these codes and standards.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think as anyone that's been involved in these things, there's a lot of time that goes into it, and almost entirely it's volunteer time. So that's an excellent point, Billy. Scott, one of the things Billy touched on right there was committee requirements in terms of population, right? So that was one of the first things I kind of learned, right? This isn't just like okay, whoever wants to sign up can be on it kind of thing. There's balance. There's got to be, well, we got consumers, we got owners, we got all these things. Can you kind of walk us through what that looks like in terms of who has to be involved from an ASCE perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it was really there's an entire document on rules for standards committee that I've been looking at through this process. Let me start by first saying anybody that has something to contribute and has the right background and energy can contribute. So there's no limitation on the contributors or the membership to this group. Where the rule exists is the voting membership. So we have a voting membership that has to have balance, which is encouraging because it's the right thing to do just intuitively. And I'll give you the categories, and I actually pulled up the list and I'll read them to you. But there are consumers, there are producers. You apply, you get assigned to a category. Many cross over into multiple categories, but you fit a certain category for this balance. So consumers, producers, general interest. A consumer it includes representatives of owners organizations, designers, and consultants retained by owners, testing laboratories retained by owners, facility operators, and insurance companies serving owners. So I view that as the user, as the specifier. So in this case, it's foundations, right? So as the user, as the specifier, as the engineering entity would be a consumer, or the building official, the building operator. The producer is often a contractor or a supplier, or even the contractor's engineer that is doing the producer or supplying. So representative of manufacturers, distributors, developers, contractors, subcontractors, construction labor organizations and associations of those groups, and professional consultants. And then there's a general category, which is the general public, which is building officials, which is academia, et cetera. So our balance category, and this is, so what we're only specifying these categories for voting membership. And we need 20 to 40% in each category. So there's your balance, right? We don't want to be heavy on engineers that are doing the specifying without contractor input. We don't want to be the other way around. And we want certainly regulatory, building official, others as well within that mix. So 20 to 40% for those three different groups. And we right now we're tweaking our voting membership that's going to be about 25 or 26 individuals.
Okay. Yeah, that was an interesting thing to me to learn right off, because you could imagine, right? One of these standards would look vastly different if it was a bunch of, those of us contractors lurking on the dark side writing this thing compared to, a bunch of consultants, or, you know what I mean? So that balance, and I've seen it firsthand in our committee calls and our meetings and everything, that balance is there for a reason, to kind of balance out those conversations in terms of, everyone comes at this with an angle. So you got to have all those kind of angles covered, which I think is a good thing. Let's see, Billy. So going back to the initial, steering committee, Scott said you guys started right kind of as everything was, all hell was breaking loose in the world with COVID. And I'm sure this is kind of maybe challenged the timeline somewhat because there was a good, however many, year and a half, 2 years in there where we weren't really in a position to get together in person as a committee. But what was the sort of timeline, envisioned in the beginning, and how are we stacking up against that?
We're behind according to the originally envisioned timeline, but I don't think that was ever expected to be met. But so once a standard is published, then it's supposed to be updated every 5 years. So Scott's original proposal was a 5-year duration, because that's just once the standard's there, then every 5 years you got to do something new with it. So that's where the 5 years came from. Since we're starting from scratch, we're not updating something. In fact, a big chunk of our document's going to be brand new. That 5 years was never gonna be a realistic end date. And
right.
I think Scott, what are we, year 4 now, or can't remember what you just said year 4. By year 4 now, we probably have another 4 to 6 years to go before this thing is actually published.
Okay. So that's an interesting thing, just to go on a sidebar here for a second. You guys, again, right, you guys have been involved in these sort of efforts before throughout your careers. That 5-year requirement to sort of freshen things up a little bit. We have a committee of about 50 or so right now, round numbers. Like, once we get this published, so we're probably, if you're talking 4 to 6 years for us to be published, so another 5 years. So we're talking something on the order of 10 years down the road. What is there a lot of consistency between the initial committee and then the ones that are involved during those subsequent updates? Is that, do you see a lot of retention along those committees along the line, or is this going to be a fresh set of eyes on this thing in 5 years?
I can speak to my experience with ASCE 61, which the first document was published in 2014, and the 5-year update is underway now. So that effort is also a little COVID delayed. I would guess that that's probably 2/3 of that original group is still there, but there is about 1/3 of new members. Also note that in our group, this Ground Improvement Standard Committee, I'm sorry, the Foundation Standards Committee, we've already lost a few people due to retirement.
Sure.
So
yeah,
there's definitely.
So if we're talking 10 years from now, yeah, right. I mean, that's a thing, absolutely. So, all right, it just popped into my mind. What is something? How many people see this thing through for that long of a period of time? All right, let's shift gears into the standard itself now, right? So, I think everyone in our industry, it's kind of like a widely accepted thing that Chapter 18 of the IBC has some holes to it, and that this standard is kind of looking to maybe plug some of those holes, clarify some things, and effectively replace that in the long run. Scott, from a high level, can you kind of talk to us a little bit about what this standard is actually going to cover?
Yeah, no doubt. So we've got one of our first missions in steering committee days was organizing ourselves in terms of content and chapters, if you will. So we know we're going to capture shallow foundations, and there's been a movement within our group to call those shallow foundations spread foundations. We'll see if that sticks as we go through, but it's got a lot of traction right now. But anyway, shallow foundations, mats, slabs, footings, those type of elements. We have a deep foundation section, which has just a lot of different foundation types that we're going to capture. And then the big elephant in the room is ground improvement. And we've made a lot of progress. There's been really good conversations around it. There's been some pull and tug. I expect that will continue, and that's probably a natural thing to occur in this case. So we're making a lot of headway there. Of course, seismic provisions. We're going to add special tests and inspections for these foundation types. We've identified that as a need. And we also struggled, which we didn't necessarily identify in the beginning, but we identified it a couple years in, knowing that we needed it based on the discussions we've been having. Special tests and inspection. We're looking at providing some baseline subsurface exploration requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And there's really, so what we've done is really embraced the motivation of this group, and folks have taken on different chapters, different assignments, and just starting to chip away at this effort, trying to make some sort of consistent approach to the tables of contents and the subsections so they kind of look alike. And really at the end, we've seen that ASCE 7 was such a tremendous document for the industry, and now they have ASCE has total control to modify that as it needs to for the profession. And I think that's what we aim to do with this in the longer term. We know we have a lot of work to do, but there's a lot of motivated people really rolling up their sleeves and going at this. So.
Yeah, now it's funny you mentioned the shallow foundations, spread foundations. One of the things that I've learned sitting through our committee meetings over the past couple of years is people call things certain things, and you like from a high level you wouldn't think that some of those would be points of like, okay, we're going to now spend 45 minutes talking about this in a committee meeting, but it's interesting to see the differences in perspective for sure. Billy, actual content wise, like, as a standard like this is taking shape, can you talk to the sort of general nature of the standard? Like, is this fall more like a guidance document? Is there going to be prescriptive design requirements? So can you talk about that for a few?
Sure. And that's actually something that we spend a lot of time explaining, I think, as we talk to potentially new members and explaining what our task is here. We are absolutely not creating a guidance document. This is a standard which will include mandatory language. And the difference is pretty straightforward, right? A guidance document will say things like, sometimes you may need to consider the bending stress in this element, and here's how you can evaluate that, and present multiple ways of how you can do this, and how you can come up with your input properties and all that sort of thing. A standard simply would say something like, when this is being done, evaluate the bending stress. And thou shalt evaluate the bending stress, and not necessarily say exactly how you do it. It's just somebody has to do it and check and make sure it's
got to be considered, right?
Yeah. And so one is a guidance document, it's more educational in nature, more of a resource. The standard is more of a it's kind of like the rules of the game. It's the minimum requirements. These are the things the design has to meet. It's not how you do the design. It's just things that have to be addressed by the design.
Yeah, we got some boxes we got to check. How you get there, there can be a lot of different ways, kind of thing. Got it. All right. Well, let's kind of stay with this, dig a little bit into the ground improvement aspect of it. Scott, in the article, we discussed it like on this scale. This is really the first attempt to, or maybe the right word is not codifying, right? But this is really kind of the first attempt at tackling ground improvement at this scale in terms of a standard or a code. Compared to the established foundation methods that we're talking about here, right? Shallow foundations, deep foundations, a lot of those have been covered by the IBC, by other codes and standards. Speak to what some of the challenges of being first here have been, really.
Yeah, it's actually been very interesting, and I've been very encouraged by the response. But the first thing that, my first reaction was related to that word codifying. I've just seen a negative connotation around that term being used, because when people hear, oh, you're writing a standard, you're codifying it, it's taking away the creativity. You're going to tell me how to do it. This is also art and science, and this is not that. So this is, sure, we're putting standards together, but Billy just said it best. We're not telling you how to do the design. We're telling you what guardrails you have to meet. We're trying to allow a project team to have a good conversation to get this right, right out of the gate. So that's what we're trying to accomplish with this. I think we have those challenges. So there's the fear of making it restrictive, limiting creativity. We're aware of that. We're trying to prevent that, but providing proper guardrails So if a project is value engineered, the owner's engineer can ask the right question, the building engineer can ask the right question. The testing will be something that we all can expect. And that's the value of this standard, providing definitions, what's X, Y, or Z.
Right.
So we're setting expectations and minimum requirements for that project team. Who does the special inspections, who specifies them? You know, and again, we know that in all foundation types and all technologies, they grow and mature over time. And we want to allow that to happen. But there's certainly some minimum requirements out there and some things that everyone knows that we can improve upon to allow for better project delivery and better and meaningful expectations across the board.
No, I think you hit on a lot of good points there, right? I mean, being on the side now of a design build, really a design build specialty contractor, you know, when I heard about this, I was interested in getting involved because, you know, we have so many jobs that can go in any number of directions in terms of who's responsible, who's designing something, who's doing the testing, who, you know, is it on the owner? Is it on the design build contractor? And there'll be, you know, as a contractor, I take a general stance, you know, because again, we'll work with engineers all over the country that some are familiar with ground improvement, you know, maybe really familiar with it where they're getting down in the weeds of design and just we act strictly as a sub that's carrying out a design. We also have other engineers that are not that familiar with it that might know that it's a good idea and they think that's the solution, but they say, Mr. Contractor, this is kind of on you. So that differentiates what my scope might be in terms of, am I including post-improvement testing? Am I including the evaluation time? Am I being expected to produce a signed and sealed document at the end of the day, verifying the allowable bearing pressures, things of that nature, right? But despite whatever those, you know, going into a job, what might be understood, I can't tell you how many jobs that we get out there and we start pounding, and all of a sudden the owner's like, well, you said you were doing this, or the engineer says, well, wait a minute, we weren't doing that. So for me, I think one thing I'm very looking forward to is like Billy said, having that list, that checklist, so that an owner or an engineer, that everyone knows maybe not necessarily how it's going to get done or who's going to do it, but that it has to be done so that going into a project, we know what boxes have to be checked. And that conversation happens before my crane hits a site rather than like 3 weeks into the work starting, right? So I think, to me, that's going to be a very positive outcome of this attempt to put a standard to ground improvement work. You know, Billy, we talked in the opening that you're one of the co-chairs for the ground improvement subcommittee within the standard group. As we've developed this chapter, we've kind of gone down one of two paths, right? We've got systems like densification, like surcharge, systems that are going to basically change the engineering properties of a soil mass to improve them to the point where they can provide the proper performance, versus systems like aggregate piers or rigid inclusions or things of that nature, where maybe you're adding stiffening elements to a soil to mitigate settlement or improve shear strength. So as we've kind of gone down that path and worked to develop our chapter content, can you provide your take, kind of looking from the top, as to like what are some of the biggest challenges we've had, in your opinion, at our subcommittee setting?
Very easy, Chris. I would say 80% of our time has been devoted to rigid inclusions, 20% to everything else.
Yeah.
And that makes perfect sense to me, because you mentioned surcharge and densification. I mean, those methods have been around for decades. They're very mature. Everybody sort of approaches them the same way.
Right.
Rigid inclusions have really come on strong in the last decade. And there's a lot of difference in practice out there as to how they're designed and what the methods are that are used for installation, the materials. It's It's all over the place.
We can't even get people to agree on definitions for certain things in our meetings, right?
Yeah. The rigid inclusions have been the big time consumer, which is good, because it's the one that needs, I think, the most work on reaching a consensus. And ultimately, that's what it's going to have to be, is something that all of the designers and all the ground improvement contractors are all happy with. And the public, we'll get a chance to have input on all this eventually too.
Hear what they have to say, sure. So, we've spent a few minutes here talking more, specifically about the ground improvement effort. That's obviously, what we focused on right in this article. But Scott, as the overall chair of the overall committee, I know you've spent time with the ground improvement group, with the Deep Founder. You've kind of bounced around to, have a pretty good idea of what most of the groups are doing. Having that sort of maybe broader perspective, is there anything that's jumped out at you? I mean, good or bad, really, like that you've noticed looking across these things, across these committees, as maybe like a trend or a theme, something that's jumped out at you?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I didn't know how it would play out, I kind of had a feeling the engineering community would be interested in this effort as the American Society of Civil Engineers. But what has really impressed me is the significant contractor support. You and your firm, Chris, Kiewit has offered out their facility to help us in mobile. Billy's now with Kiewit, but they mobilized a bunch of professionals to help us. Almost all the ground improvement folks looking to contribute, but people are genuinely motivated to do this and get it right. Again, I was worried about resistance to anything, and I haven't felt that. I felt, debate, and getting it right and what's right, and being careful as to what that looks like. But I haven't seen anyone from this group say, no, we're not doing this. This is a bad idea overall. So that's been encouraging. And between these different entities, we've identified multiple gaps. And you mentioned in the last question regarding, steps to the process. I mean, we found a need to identify roles and responsibilities as part of this. So that's been a clear gap, whether it's design, bid, build, or design, bid, build, value engineering, delegated design. We can help with different roles that need to be filled, whatever that delivery is. Let's see, definitions, Billy said. What else? The other thing I've seen that's been nice is the geographic and demographic involvement. I see we've got folks from the South, folks from New Orleans area clearly has certain ground conditions versus the seismic conditions out west versus the Northeast versus the Midwest. And we've got folks from all geographic locations, which is helpful. And we have folks that's been nice because we've learned from sole proprietors and big firms and just different ways people practice, and that all has to be considered because we have to understand that the standard of practice varies across the board. So it's been as a professional, I've gotten so much value out of this just with the conversations that listening to or participating in, and has really been encouraging and very productive, I would say.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree with you in the sense that, like, the collaborative nature, right? Because you think about it, at the end of the day, the vast majority of we're all competitors in some capacity, right, on the contracting side. And I've sat in enough committee meetings, whether it's Geo-Institute, DFI, whatever, and I'm sure you guys have had your fair share of this, where people are getting ready to go across the table with each other because of disagreements on how things are being done within those committees. But I really have not sensed that at all. Yeah, you get some opinions and some strong opinions, but the respectful and collaborative nature that everyone has come at this with, like you said, Scott, to try and get this right has been very, I think it's made for like an enjoyable effort. It's not like, okay, we got our monthly call and now we're going to, be kind of doing this thing again. Right. So that's been definitely something I can agree with. When we talk specifically about ground improvement, a lot of the work is proprietary in nature, probably the majority of it, right? Completed under, under various design build scenarios. So Billy, within our chapter within the standard, can you speak to how maybe these responsibilities are how we're tackling them in terms of maybe design or testing or oversight, being identified and assigned, and how these responsibilities are maybe, a step further, how are they kind of being lined up when we start thinking about special inspections as well?
Yes, that's been a challenge for us, right? And as Scott mentioned, we recognize that we need to define roles and responsibilities, but the people that the experienced standards writers, like Scott mentioned, Greg Sewells is heavily involved from SCI. He's very involved with ASCE 7, and he keeps us straight as what a standard can and cannot address. And one of the things it cannot address is contractual requirements.
Right.
So we somehow have to identify the roles of a delegated design or a design builder or the engineer that's reviewing something versus the one that's doing. We have to get all those somehow defined without getting into the contractual issues. So it's something we recognize has to be done. I think we'll figure it out. I think we've got some good ideas in play right now. And I think it's going to be a big improvement because, right, if you look at, well, there is no foundation standard right now, but we go to chapter 18 of the IBC, which ultimately, right, is what we're hoping to replace or supplement. That's not addressed at all. And so if we move the needle a little bit, it'll be a big improvement, I think.
Yeah, and I think along those lines, in terms of responsibilities, one of the other things we've spent a lot of time talking about is criteria, right? Like the beginning, right? As a contractor, you have to design to something. And so that to me is something that feels like it's been kind of not addressed throughout the previous efforts to develop codes and standards that we've spent a lot of time talking about. Like, what are the expectations, right? Because we're collaborative with the structural engineers as well. So the load conditions, the settlement requirements, that sort of criteria that we need to design to as engineers and contractors, that's also something we've spent a lot of time talking about, who's going to be responsible for that as well.
Yeah.
So in our committee meetings, we've had lots of those sort of bigger picture items that we've discussed, right? Performance criteria, special inspections. We've talked about things such as LRFD versus ASD for design. Scott, sitting across the various chapters, being in different meetings from time to time, can you speak to maybe the synergy you've seen between these different chapters? Because at the end of the day, all these chapters are going to have to roll up and be a coherent document, right? In the idea of this standard. So can you talk to that a little bit, how you've seen maybe some of those pieces kind of talked about at the committee level, but then back up to the big picture?
Yeah, I guess what we've seen is, let's call it spread foundations, deep foundations, ground improvement. What we've naturally seen is, deep foundations would start to look at what IBC is doing or others, and the approach for the document might follow that. The shallow foundations might follow something else that isn't necessarily the same format, as to how the chapter flows. And then ground improvement, what does it do as a fresh document? So what we've really done is, we've had each chapter struggle through its work. We've seen the content, and then we say, okay, how do we want to reorganize this so they look the same? They will not be one for one the same, but they look and feel the same. So an engineer or a building official or an owner or a contractor can look through it and understand the approach. So that's one, and we're making a lot of progress there. Number two is LRFD, ASD. So we had a lot of discussions over LRFD and what are the reliability factors and what are we looking to do there, and how about ASD, which most of us as building foundation designers, or not, let's call it non-bridge foundation designers, gravitate towards. And quite frankly, we spent probably a good amount of year one and a half struggling a lot with LRFD and probably letting those details get in the way of progress. And what we've done is we've tabled LRFD for now. We're going to do both. We know ASD is what a lot of us are comfortable with, but we know LRFD is where the world is going. We are so fortunate to have Jerry DiMaggio and Eric Lohr on the committee who are intimate with these, and Vern Schaefer and others who know this content. But most of us understand ASD pretty well within the foundation design arena, and we're going to start there because we go down rabbit holes fast with LRFD, and until we know what the framework of this is, it's not worth the effort. It is going to be worth the effort at some point, but not now, because we're trying to figure out what we want to accomplish in this and what does it look like from just a traditional factor of safety standpoint. So that's one. And then the other, I would say, is, you know, we're engineers, we're contractors, most of us are detail oriented, everyone wants perfection. And what I would say, the guidance I would give is don't let perfection get in the way of progress. We're fearful of the ramifications of something that we do that might have an unknown consequence. We have to vet that, but we probably have to be willing to take some reasonable risks once we vet them, and then fix an error if we make it in the follow-up, or add commentary that allows something to be captured if there's an error in it. And I think we're starting to come around to that thinking. Because there's so many details to focus on, if we get down to every nitty gritty detail, we'll lose the forest from the trees.
Yeah, so. It does not. With this group, it does not take very much to get stuck down a wormhole that it may take us some time to get out of. That's for sure. Billy, you've been in you've played in the ground improvement sandbox for a long time as well. We've talked about this, with the subcommittee and with the entire committee. We've talked about a little bit here today, how tricky of a beast ground improvement is, right? Contractors, we don't want to be told how to do our job, right? We're all experts. Just ask us, right? But in the absence of codes or standards to this point, maybe the owners and engineers haven't felt like there's a tremendous amount of a mechanism for them to, in the owner's case, really understand what's going on, or push back on the contractors when they don't agree with something that's being done or that's being proposed. So, how do you see with this standard, and specifically with the ground improvement work that we're doing, where do you see the most help coming to our industry with this?
So Chris, I'll use an example that Lori Simpson with Langen gave. Lori's a very active member of the committee, and she brought this up in one of the early ground improvement meetings. And that was, she was working on a project in the Bay Area, had a performance spec, anticipated rigid inclusion, ground improvement system was going to be needed. The owner got 3 proposals from 3 different installers, all 3 rigid inclusion proposals. One was a unreinforced concrete rigid inclusion. Another one was a concrete rigid inclusion with a center bar. And the third one was a concrete rigid inclusion with a full cage. So as the owner's engineer, she's supposed to evaluate which one of those is appropriate. Well, there's absolutely nothing out there that you can point to say this is sufficient. So I don't know which one of those was sufficient, but it shouldn't have been a question. It should have been clear that, this is the minimum that's necessary in this situation, and that doesn't exist right now. And I think that this document would be tremendously valuable if it could handle that sort of question.
No, I mean, and that's I don't know what I do remember her telling that story, and you're right. I don't know which one. I don't remember if she said which one was chosen or not. But what I'm certain of is that there's definitely cost implications between those 3, right? And there's no way for her as the engineer to be able to point to, well, this one skipped steps A, B, and C. So yes, it's a fraction of the cost of the other 2, so we all know, right? We've been in this thing. Owners, they tend to look at the bottom line. So they may go right to a solution that is maybe not appropriate, right? But in the absence of being able to explain that, I mean, it's certainly a challenge.
And I'm sure all the designers of each one of those systems was completely confident that their design was satisfying the requirements, because they were looking at different demands, apparently, right? So
absolutely. So we've talked about it. We've been at this for a couple of years, and right now we're kind of at that stage of the first mock ballot, which means we still got a way to go, right? So as we're continuing down this task, Scott, what do you see from where we are right now to this document, this first edition of the foundation standard document being published? What do you see as some of the biggest hurdles we have left to kind of overcome collectively as a group to get to that publishing point?
I mean, we right now we've got to do the work, right? So we've kind of rallied around consistency. Now we need to populate content and test it. So really populating those different pieces are significant because a drilled shaft is different than a rigid inclusion. An auger cast pile is different than an aggregate pier versus a mat versus slab. All of those need sections and need content. So that needs a lot of work. And then when the work happens by one or two, that needs to then get kicked around and reworked. So it's really kind of grinding on that. It's getting volunteers to dig in. And again, we have many. It's really vetting definitions early as we develop something for a certain type of system, so we know what we're attacking. It's not letting perfection get in the way of progress. Again, the fear of getting it wrong and the secondary effects, which I spoke to, but we cannot let it derail us for 6 months if we can put a sentence of commentary to kind of keep the spirit of it, because it's been happening and we've all seen it.
Yeah.
In a perfect world, we'd lock ourselves. We make the most progress when we're sitting in the room for 2 days in person, which we've been doing twice a year. It's a big commitment for people to do, but that's where a lot of the good work happens. It happens behind the scenes also, but we see a lot of perspectives and we really make a lot of gain a lot of common ground in those in-person meetings. I've been most excited with the last one or two that we've had. And this past one I thought was our most productive in-person meeting, 3 years in now. But it really felt like we're starting to make some bigger strides. So I was encouraged by that.
So I just wanted to quickly acknowledge here, again, being a member of the committee, working with you guys, and being a member of the committee that coming into this effort had absolutely zero experience with codes or standard development or anything like that. It's been a privilege working with you guys, and I've learned a ton. And I think when we do get to the finish line where this first edition is published, I think I'm speaking for myself, but I'm sure I'm speaking for kind of all of us, that it's going to be a very rewarding feeling knowing all the effort that goes into this, and then finally seeing this document published. We got a couple questions that have started coming in, but before we dig into those, as we get ready to continue down our path of working on this, is there any final thoughts, any things we skipped over that you guys want to hit on real quick?
Not here.
All right.
You're good, Chris. You're good.
Well, here, then let's get your reaction to this. So as we've been sitting here chatting, Brad put up a poll in the chat just for curiosity's sake, with the question being, how do you generally feel about standards in geotechnical engineering? And there were 4 responses you could give. We need more now. It's okay to have a few, but not more. Standards put engineers in a box, or, D, none of the above kind of thing, right? So the response that Scott got from the poll was 36%, about a third, said we need more standards now. Another third, 36%, said it's okay to have a few, but not more. And then you had the other third was broken up between standards put engineers in a box or something else, right? So you got a third saying we need more now. We got a third saying maybe a little, and then kind of a third saying pound sand sort of thing. So you guys, does that surprise you guys at all?
Well, I mean, I would say, it's actually related to, there's another question that's here that you're probably going to get to, but it's related. Sean O'Connell says, guidance for owners to procure ground improvement is lacking, very difficult to get it right, especially on DB with limited data. do we know of any effort on this front in ASCE? And that's what we're doing, right? We're trying to define roles and responsibilities. So we need this. I think the fear is, like, I was a little bit let down by that poll, but I don't know. Maybe it's the categories of the boxes they could check that might have steered the answers and directions. But these are standards that are put in place to allow a project team with a specialty system being put in place. In some cases, not all, some are routine or some are more mainstream, but it allows people to have meaningful conversations about what someone is buying as a foundation. What are the expectations for delivery, and are we getting what we thought we got? And that's directly related to Sean's question. And I would say that's why we need this standard, certainly for ground improvement. And we know that there's gaps and inconsistencies in the IBC that's been, it's been modified over years. So it's become a little bit disjointed, and there's things that we can do better to streamline. And we know there's a geochemical coalition that Lori Simpson and Dan Stevenson are working with to improve that. But it's an arduous, and they're making great strides, but it's an arduous task, and you can make incremental improvements. But anyway, we know these exist. So this is not to stifle creativity. This is not to tell you this is how it's done. This is really to get better project delivery, is really my takeaway from this. And I'll pass it over to Billy for his thoughts on it.
I'm surprised that the poll wasn't more negative against standards. I think that geotechs are, in my experience, are very reluctant to say we need standards. It's the lack of creativity, and also the fact that it's very hard to come up with prescriptive requirements that work everywhere in the world of geotech, because we deal with such different geologies, different materials. And along those lines, kind of related to this, which something that I see frequently in the standards effort, is the people that do get involved with the standards writing process, sometimes they want to try to use it to fix bad engineering. And we've got to keep in mind that you can't fix bad engineering with the standard. I see another question came in regarding, are there going to be minimum requirements for field and laboratory testing? And that you can look at that in multiple ways, but one scenario I can imagine is somebody seeing something that doesn't have enough site characterization data and saying we need to do something and require more lab testing. Well, in some places in the world, you maybe don't need any lab testing for a particular project. So how do you write a standard that fits that balance? And that's a challenge that our group is discussing at every meeting, is coming up with that balance between these minimum requirements and what's absolutely necessary versus what's too much.
Right. No, and that last question, right? So talking about the requirements for field or lab testing, things like that, it started out with, what do you believe is lacking in routine geotechnical engineering reports? And maybe I'll field this one from a contractor standpoint. It's, you got to think about what's needed, right? So there'll be a lot of reports that I get that as a ground improvement designer, I'm asked to come up with a solution, and I don't have loads. I barely have building layouts. I don't, right? So there's got to be some standardization there too, in terms of what's included. And that comes back to this performance criteria. As a contractor, it's very hard to design a program if you don't know what you're designing for. And some of that comes back to, there's the ongoing debate within the industry about commoditization and trying to spend as little, owners trying to spend as little money as possible on geotech reports, so that doesn't really maybe afford the opportunity to issue revised reports, as a project's developed or something like that. But that's definitely something that I've seen. Just what's that information that's needed for the ground improvement designers to be able to carry out their job. Scrolling back up, this is something maybe we touched on it, but since the question came in, I guess maybe we didn't. But one of the first questions we had in here, and maybe Scott, I'll direct this at you. Can you, speak, who do we really feel like this standard's being developed for? Is it being geared for the geotech? Is it being geared for the clients, for agencies? I mean, I kind of feel like it's all the above, but I mean, what are your thoughts?
It is all the above, and let's just look at it. There's, and people are often doing their work in silos because that's how they're retained. But there's an initial geotechnical engineer that's doing their report. If you have this guidance information and this is potential, then they'll have an understanding. You have an architect and a structural engineer working on behalf of an owner. What do they need to know? What do they need to get from the geo report? Then you have a potential value engineer or design build scenario where you have a contractor coming in, and what do they need to know? What do they need to learn? What are we trying to satisfy? Settlement control, resistance, etc. Building official, what questions do they need to ask for something that's unique and new or maybe less common in a certain area? And what happens if all these engineers don't have experience with this system? The building owner, so he can point to its design team to say, okay, what are we looking at here? What are we generally having? So it's all of them. You think about all those different parties on a team, and where the expertise resides can be in different boxes. Almost all that, can be in different boxes on any given project. So by doing this, it allows better communication and just setting expectations and just getting a project right.
Yeah, and maybe to Billy's point earlier when you were sharing the anecdote from Lori, it gives, depending on what angle you're coming into this on, it gives the engineer something to point to talking to the owner, or it's got the owner something to point to talking to a potential contractor working for it, right? So it's kind of all the puzzle pieces together. So, well, gentlemen, I think we've come up on about an hour. I don't see any further questions coming in for Brad. I don't know if you guys have anything further here, or we can bring Brad in to kind of wrap us up if you don't. There you go.
Yeah,
moved inside.
We're good. Yeah, I had
it got a little hot out there for you, buddy.
No, despite the palatial nature of the Keeler estate, when you live in a close-in suburb, we got a half acre. The landscapers showed up next door, and I had no choice. It got a little loud, and I didn't think that was going to work too well. So yeah, I moved inside. No, this was fantastic. I think I shared Billy's surprise when I ran that poll. Now, I do feel like many members of the committee may have been in the audience today, and that may have swayed the votes a little bit. But either way, I think it's important that we start moving towards this. The message that we have, and Billy, you've been an outstanding spokesperson for GI to our membership on this one. The message that we have to get out there is we're not trying to put people in a box. Billy, you kind of hit on every key point. I think this is really about, I guess the wrong term is setting the floor, right? But you guys
bringing
are
in some minimum requirements to kind of get everyone to the same playing field.
So, for everybody who participated today, thank you. For asking questions, especially thank you. We really appreciate that. That's what makes these presentations amazing. Please stay involved, follow the progress as we walk through the standard. You heard Billy and Scott say it's going to be 4 to 6 years before this comes to market, before it's complete. There may be other opportunities for everybody to weigh in. Certainly the committee will be meeting several more times in between now and then. There is a lot of work to be done. So again, thanks for joining us today on GeoStrata Extra. If you liked what you saw, and I always say you're here at the end, so you probably did, click like, subscribe, get notifications, and we will, of course, let you know every time we post something to the YouTube channel. One more big thank you to our sponsor for today, GeoPeer. Really appreciate that. Our next live stream is going to be in 2 days, just 48 hours away. It's going to be episode 4 of our series with Keller and their seismic series. So you'll want to come back for that. I don't know if I have anything left to say, except have a great afternoon, enjoy your summer, and we will see everybody again very soon.